for combat operation.
You know, I wish there were more games based around the mecha genre. You could come up with some really interesting mechanics and concepts for games based on these machines, especially considering how diverse and distinct their capabilities and appearances can be. The sky's the limit with what they can do and what form they come in, and I think we've only scratched the surface with this genre when it comes to video games. Mechas are just extremely cool, and the unique experience and sensation of being at the controls of your very own is one I'd love to have more often, especially with the technology we have nowadays that could really bring this kind of game to the next level. Games like Armored Core still come out every so often, and plenty of games still incorporate them as enemy types or as an obtainable vehicle during a specific section or under certain circumstances, but really there aren't that many games that come out these days that focus on putting you at the controls of a giant machine and letting you go to town. I mean, even Metal Gear Solid, a series named after its titular bipedal tanks, only let you pilot one in its fourth main entry, and that was hands down the coolest part of that game. But how about today we take a look at a series exclusively about high-speed mecha action with close ties to the Metal Gear Solid series and Kojima himself. That would be Zone of the Enders, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about the second main entry in the series, Zone of the Enders: The Second Runner, which came out on the PlayStation 2 in 2003. The game is a little over 12 years old at this point, yet in all of that time, there really hasn't been a game to tackle mecha-based combat in the same way The Second Runner did conceptually. And there definitely hasn't been a game since it that has been able to top how fast, smooth, and responsive it was able to make the act of flying a giant machine through the air feel, or how stylish it was able to make it all look. Zone of the Enders is a series I'm sure a lot of you are at least aware of, especially if you're a fan of Metal Gear because of the frequent little references Kojima likes to throw in about it throughout the later Metal Gear Solid titles. People know about the series and think it looks cool, but I haven't talked to many people who have actually played the games. The series consists of two main games on the PlayStation 2, a Game Boy Advance spin-off called The Fist of Mars, an OVA, and a 26-episode anime. All of these titles were released from 2001 to 2003, so you can see that the series was only really active for a short time, with the only exception being an HD collection from 2012 that we'll discuss later. The series takes place in the late 22nd century, where humans have begun expanding into space, establishing colonies on Mars and orbiting Jupiter. With that expansion came the discovery of a supercharged ore known as Metatron that they began mining off of Callisto, one of the many moons surrounding Jupiter. The discovery of Metatron brought forth rapid technological advancements, most notably in the form of orbital frames, the mechas of this universe. Though the people of Earth aren't that friendly to those living in the colonies, referring to them as Enders for whatever reason. That's where the title of the series comes from, as the games take place on Mars and around Jupiter, making it the Zone of the Enders. This unease between the colonists and Earth gives rise to a ruthless military faction known as Baram, which seeks to cut ties with Earth by force, though their intentions aren't entirely as they seem. The games deal with ideas of independence and how beaten down people can be manipulated by those with pretty words. You know, typical themes you'd see in other works by Kojima such as Metal Gear Solid, so fans of his should feel right at home here. Unfortunately, the series never really managed to move out of the shadow of the Metal Gear Solid series in terms of recognition, and a lot of that probably has to do with the way the games were marketed. A lot of people just saw the series as that other thing Kojima was involved with. When anyone ever brings up the first Zone of the Enders, it's always in reference to the fact that it was originally sold with a demo for the highly anticipated Metal Gear Solid 2. They even did a callback to that when they made the Zone of the Enders HD collection by selling it with a demo for Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. A lot of people only bought the original Zone of the Enders for that demo of Metal Gear Solid 2, and those who actually gave the game a chance found that there wasn't that much substance to it. It wasn't a bad game by any means, it's just that aside from the core combat system, which it managed to pull off very well, there wasn't much else going for the game to pull people in, which means it didn't leave that much of an impression on players. But instead of laying down and dying, the series bounced back Devil May Cry 3 style, propelled by a newfound sense of identity and direction, delivering a vastly improved experience over its predecessor in every way. The first game was a small story about a kid trying to survive an attack on his colony that was a little rough around the edges. But suddenly the second runner comes along, refining the mechanics of the first game into a lightning-fast space adventure in the middle of a galactic war where you're flying around taking on giant fleets of battleships, with guest designs from Kazuma Kaneko from Shin Megami Tensei fame, and one of the characters flying around in a mecha version of Vic Viper from Gradius. It's always awesome to see a sequel improve over the previous entries in a series, especially to this degree. It's the kind of success story that makes you excited excited to see what a developer can come up with next. The game follows a new character named Dingo Egret who works as a miner on Callisto when he stumbles upon Jehuti, the orbital frame from the first game, abandoned in the ice. From there, he gets sucked into the conflict between Earth and Baram when his life is tied to Jehuti and only it and another orbital frame can start and stop a universe-destroying superweapon entitled Auman. That other frame would be Anubis, whose runner is Nomen, the underhanded and heartless leader of Baram. The series sort of revolves around these two frames whose fates are tied to one another, one being used for good and one being used for evil. It's an engaging narrative throughout, despite somehow being very simple but very confusing at the same time. Metal Gear Solid has this same problem, where characters will constantly talk about the world they live in and what's going on in it, but you never actually get a chance to see it and really understand it yourself. This is intensified here because Metal Gear at least took place in a setting similar to our own, but here you're just going off little things characters say but never really being able to get a good idea of what the world is like for the people living in it. Even then, the game always manages to hold your attention, and a lot of that has to do with just how good the game looks. It really doesn't scream PlayStation 2 game when it comes to graphics because the art design behind it is that exceptional. If you couldn't tell already, the designs in the game are done by Yoji Shinkawa, the man you probably know for doing concept art and designs for many of the games Kojima has been involved in. The orbital frame designs he created specifically for Jehuti and Anubis look striking and imaginative, even if the cockpits on these things are cockpits. The series uses an Egyptian motif as a way to differentiate itself from other mecha franchises, and while it may seem arbitrary, you can't deny that it adds a mysterious, almost divine element to the game's world. These themes also contrast interestingly with the futuristic setting and technology they're paired with. The physical graphics of the game feel like a mixture of Metal Gear Solid 2's art style, but with simpler, more flatly colored textures similar to the style used in a game like Mega Man Legends. This makes the characters on the screen pop despite the dark and drab environments you're often going through. The game wasn't trying to go for incredibly realistic graphics, so it's aged really well. Another reason the game is aged well graphically is because they avoided having human character models appear in-game. Instead, they went for fully animated sequences whenever a character is on screen, and they look really good. They're very well animated, detailed, and give the game an added sense of personality. This was a great idea that allowed them to bypass the limitations of the console and fully realize their characters in the way they wanted them to be. And credit has to go out to the animation studio Gonzo for putting the effort they did into making these look as good as they do, especially when their work is known for being pretty hit or miss in terms of quality. There are also a lot of really impressive effects being used in this game that are not only visually interesting, but do a great job illustrating the intensity behind certain attacks. The dub for the game is not so great though. The voices sound good for the most part, it's just that every so often they'll deliver a line very awkwardly as if they misinterpreted what the line was meant to convey.
You're trying to revolt against Norman.
Revolt? No, I'll just fight.
I think this mainly has to do with poor directing, and this came out after Metal Gear Solid 2, so it really goes to show how another series like Metal Gear Solid could have ended up sounding if they put less time into it. With all that out of the way, let's get into the meat of the game, the combat. The second runner is a hack and slash, but unlike most others, its combat takes place in the air where you can freely ascend and descend at will. This alone adds another dimension to combat. In other games, the floor is your natural alignment, and from there you can jump into the air to pull off attacks before falling back down. In the second runner, you always have free reign to dodge and attack enemies from any direction you choose. Most games don't allow movement like this because it's very difficult to control, but the second runner mitigates this by being heavily based around its lock-on. You can switch between enemies easily and toggle it on or off, but you'll usually want to be aligned with an enemy for easy navigation around any given combat space. When you aren't locked on, the camera always centers itself behind you once you stop moving, so you never lose your bearings. Jehuti also comes fit with these intuitive rings around it that display the location of enemies and incoming hazards even when they're out of your line of sight. So you can see, the game is designed around accommodating the various different hangups that can result from free three-dimensional movement. Not only that, but the camera does a great job of framing the action in visually interesting ways when you're attacking an enemy head-on. The two major factors of the combat system are distance and boosting. Depending on whether you're in close range or long range or whether you're boosting or not, changes what moves you'll pull off with the same inputs. You'll perform slashes when you're close up and fire off projectiles when you're far away. When you're boosting, you'll perform powered up versions of those attacks, such as a powerful dashing slash or homing lasers that can go after dozens of targets at once. You'll also perform different attacks with the boost button if you're standing still. When you do, you can charge up a powerful energy ball or perform a spinning attack that breaks guards depending on your range. Aside from that, you have a shield of your own and the ability to grab various items in the environment to use as weapons or as stronger shields. Everything you grab can also be charged up with your boost ability when standing still to increase its damage output. The grab ability can also be switched out for various sub-weapons at any time during gameplay in a way that should seem very familiar. You collect these sub-weapons as you beat bosses, and they're usually some form of projectile that has its own unique attribute. I don't want to spoil exactly what it is, but near the end of the game you obtain a sub-weapon that completely alters the way you play, and it's extremely exhilarating to use. The biggest difference between the first game and the second runner is structure. The first game had you flying around a space colony and descending down into small zones to move the story along or to protect civilians like some sort of giant mecha Batman. The second runner is strictly level-based, so the game is always pushing you forward to the next intense scene. You never stay in the same area for too long, and whenever something is getting old, it'll switch things up with a new form of challenge or level gimmick. For example, a scene where you chase after a speeding train or an environment consisting of shifting pillars that can crush enemies. What makes the combat in the game great isn't necessarily how many moves you have, it's the mobility you have while using them. You're always on the move, shooting off projectiles whenever you can, cutting enemies up when you're close enough, dodging attacks as soon as you can spot them, and controlling your distance. Thankfully, the game is incredibly fast and responsive, keeping up with every button press and minute analog stick input you throw at it. The combat system requires quick thinking and precision. Every ability you have is there for a reason, and you'll have to use everything at your disposal to stay alive. This is not an easy game, even though you might get that impression from it. Even the boss fights are often more like Metal Gear Solid style puzzle bosses than just two giant machines wailing away at each other. You'll often have to do sections of the game multiple times because it just doesn't go easy on you. But it's always possible to pull off a flawless victory if you're on your toes and paying attention to your surroundings. The music in the game also deserves credit for how well it keeps energy up in combat. It's sort of surreal due to the unearthly vocals it all has, but it never manages to be distracting or unpleasant. Maintaining mobility and situational awareness is key in this game, and that's what I like about it. Combat is just so active and engaging both visually and mentally. It really captures the feeling of controlling a highly advanced piece of machinery that can outmaneuver most of its competition with its nimble agility. It's very stylish, and while its combat system isn't as expansive and fleshed out as ones found in other games in the genre, it definitely isn't style over substance, meaning both those who just want to play a cool mecha game and those who want a challenge will find the experience rewarding. The game even comes together at the end with a satisfying conclusion, but even then, you still want more. The first game was a bit awkward, but the second runner completely raises the bar, and you want to know what the series can pull off now that it's found its stride. But there is no next time for this series despite recent attempts. Even though there hasn't been an entry in the series in over a decade, the team never really gave up on the series. In 2012, Konami hosted an event to announce the release date of the Zone of the Enders HD collection, and they also used this as an opportunity to announce the Enders Project, a new Zone of the Enders title that they were working on in Fox Engine. They were only in the concept phase, but what we got to see of their vision was really remarkable. From what I can gather, they were aiming for a fantasy aesthetic more so than a futuristic one, and the game was meant to take place either in some sort of ancient civilization or alternate universe. Judging from the concept art, it looks like this game would have been based not around giant mecha, but exoskeletons. In this piece, it shows what the process of getting into one of these suits would look like. Not only that, but in the concept art for the main orbital frame, you can see long hair flowing from its helmet. It's safe to assume that the main character of the game would have been this woman, and her orbital frame would have been this heavy metal looking suit instead of a giant mecha. Another piece of art I was able to dig up and link to the project is one Kojima tweeted randomly one day without any other information. This was back when Metal Gear Solid 5 was known as Project Ogre, and we didn't even know it was set to be a Metal Gear title, so people didn't know what to make of this piece of art. But when you take the concept art from the original showing of the Enders Project and compare it to this piece, you can clearly see that it's the middle step in the main character's transformation into their suited form. She has some sort of sword here while the suit has a huge bladed arm, so perhaps the suit would form around that as well? Could there have been some sort of dual form combat system where the main character would transition between fighting with a normal sword with her face exposed and a powered up form using all of the suit's capabilities? Maybe she would shift between them for ground and airborne combat. The designs shown off were much more unrefined and demonic looking than their counterparts from the previous games. Every design seemed to have wings of some kind. Even this version of Anubis seemed to be an exoskeleton, as you can see it's being worn by a woman here. Seeing as this was potentially set in the distant past, maybe it would have finally explained the relevance of the Egyptian themes throughout the series. This is almost all speculation, so don't take what I'm saying too seriously, but regardless, it seems like they were really dedicated to not only revitalizing the Zone of the Enders franchise, but also creating something incredibly unique and breathtaking in its own right. It definitely looked very different than the previous games, but it was still retaining that Zone of the Enders style. Could you imagine these pieces of art come to life in the Fox engine at 60 frames per second on current hardware? Not only that, but the Enders project still left the series open for a true Zone of the Enders 3 if the series ever got that far. Unfortunately, the massive backlash the HD collection faced at launch caused the project to come to a screeching halt before it even had a chance to really get going. The collection was justifiably slammed for severe technical issues, and if they wanted to kick off the relaunch of the franchise on a good note, it just shouldn't have been released in the state it was in. These issues manifested most notably in the frame rates for both titles. Now, the originals weren't perfect 60 frames per second, and the second runner specifically had frame rate drops and slowdown during really intense scenes, but that's at least understandable when you're a PlayStation 2 game trying to pull this stuff off. That excuse doesn't apply when you're re-releasing two games 10 years later on vastly superior hardware. These problems shouldn't exist anymore, and they especially shouldn't be more severe than they were in the previous generation's versions. In the collection, the second runner was sub 30 frames per second at times with constant drops, and both games were missing graphical effects from the originals and were incredibly aliased. They had to hire a second developer just to create a patch for the game to fix these problems, and even then it only applies to the second runner and only to the PlayStation 3 version. If you had bought the game on the Xbox 360, you are out of luck. Thankfully, this patch improves the second runner immensely, though unfortunately the original Zone of the Enders still suffers frame rate and graphical issues that will never be addressed. Though if any of the games were going to be patched, I'm glad it was the second runner, and this is now a worthy recreation that's worth recommending to people who haven't had a chance to play the original, even though it still isn't a completely perfect 60 frames per second. I was able to get the collection off Amazon new for only $10, so you should be able to get it for a fair price just to experience the second runner. If you're interested in playing the first game, I'd honestly recommend just getting an original PlayStation 2 copy of it just because it doesn't have the issues the HD version does. It's just really disappointing that the collection was botched like this, especially knowing that the future of the series depended on its success and that we potentially lost a fantastic game because of it. All they had to do was improve the frame rates and resolutions of the two games a bit and everything would have been dandy, but somehow High Voltage managed to drop the ball. Didn't these guys make the Conduit on the Wii? I thought they were supposed to be technical wizards or something. Obviously, the team at Kojima Productions cared about the project and the future of the franchise. They even had a whole new intro animated for the collection by Studio Sunrise, which looks great and does a fantastic job unifying the two games under a single art style. This isn't the first time Konami has mismanaged an HD collection, but they really should have gotten a developer like Bluepoint Games to do it instead of picking a developer at random like Hijinks Studio for Silent Hill and then rushing it out the door before it was ready. It just makes everyone involved look stupid. The Enders project was never officially cancelled to my knowledge, just put on hold as they reevaluated the future of the series. But with all this recent news about the future of Kojima at Konami, it's uncertain if we'll ever hear from the franchise again. Even if Kojima Productions didn't make the next Zone of the Enders, can you imagine if they let a studio like Platinum Games take a crack at a sequel? That would be a pretty perfect pair-up in my opinion. It's fine though, the second runner is still a fantastic game and that won't change. The series never got the recognition it needed to prosper, which is really disappointing because I think it could have continued to get better and better. If you haven't already, check the game out and enjoy what this franchise was able to offer in the short time it was active. It's definitely something fresh even to this day, because no other hack and slash really plays like it, and because of that I think it's an experience that will really stick with you. Don't expect the game to be a pushover, and remember to stay vigilant, because the enemies you'll face won't hesitate to wipe the floor with you. Who knows, maybe one day we'll get to see another runner take flight.